In this lecture, we shall study closely the work of a follower of Kant who, though he carefully preserved the epistemological slant of his master, turned that slant in a new, more fully romantic direction. That is, towards the fusion or synthesis of subject and object. Through an analysis of his Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man and on naive and sentimental poetry, we shall divine Friedrich Schiller's central aesthetic goal, to bring back into unity the emotional and rational side of our being. Now, Schiller was born a generation after Kant. He is very much a Kantian. Kant is very much his master that he looks up to. But what Schiller does is basically to romanticize the ideas of Kant. First, let's look at the similarity. In one hand, what Schiller does is simply expand on the epistemological theories of Kant. Let's look at some examples of that. First of all, for Schiller, as for Kant, beauty remains a subjective experience that is free and indifferent. He still believes it's subjective, and he still is into this idea of freedom, of an end in itself, a purposeless purpose. He gets that from Kant. Another thing, he agrees with Kant that the free play of mental powers is still to be put at center stage. Remember, beauty is that harmony between the imagination and the understanding, whereas the sublime is a disharmony between imagination and reason. He still believes in that free play of mental powers. And finally, he still tends to privilege aesthetic form over didactic content. Like Kant, he tends to be a formalist and go for the form, which is something that doesn't change and is free. However, even though there are these similarities, Schiller gives these theories a new romantic focus and end. And so, while Burke privileged judgment over imagination, analysis over reason, and whereas Kant privileged the disharmony of the sublime over the harmony of the beautiful, Schiller, who's really quite a romantic at this point, champions both synthesis and harmony. We're starting to move into what is really romanticism. When you start privileging synthesis and harmony rather than difference and judgment and whatnot, you're moving into romanticism. Now, the ideal for Schiller, what Schiller is seeking, finally, is a fusion or incarnation of subject and object. You see, in Kant, the subject and the object are divided from each other, and never the twain shall meet. Schiller begins what is really the romantic project, if you want to call it that, and that is to bring the object and the subject together in a fusion, a synthesis, or we might use the word marriage. Now, as you might guess, this gives a mystical, spiritual bent to Schiller that is not really there in Kant. Kant is more logical and rational. But when you start talking about marriage, the two into one flesh, bringing together, you're really moving into an arena that is, again, mystical and spiritual. We want to bring the two together. Now, part of the reason that Schiller can do this, or at least attempt to do it, is that nature takes on a greater and a different importance in Schiller than it does in Kant or Burke. For Kant and Burke and other traditional epistemologists, nature is pretty much a dead object. But in Schiller and the later Romantics, they believed that nature, too, seeks a kind of perfection. So the object and the subject are both moving towards each other. And again, there's the need to heal the division, to bring the two together. This romantic view of nature that we talk about is the romantic belief that we can bring together the mind, the subjective mind, and nature. In fact, Wordsworth and Coleridge in their poetry speak of what they call the marriage of mind and nature, or the marriage of the subject and the object, bringing them again together in a synthesis or a marriage. All right, that's a little bit of background. Now let's get more specific and look at Schiller's great work, The Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. And this really is a collection of letters. And I should say that those of you interested in education, you must read this, because this is not only important to aesthetics and poetry, it's very important to education, because he's talking about what an education should do. And he's thinking particularly of the humanities. Now, in his Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, Schiller looks back with awe on the classical age. but not for the same reasons as the neoclassicists did. Remember, they also loved the ancients and looked back with longing and nostalgia to the classical world. Schiller did that too, but for a different reason. The reason that he looks back is that Schiller believes that the ancient Greeks had a natural humanity that we have lost. It's different than nature and rules and decorum. He looks back because he believed that the ancients, particularly the Greeks, possessed a fullness that could fuse imagination and reason. The ancient Greeks, he believed, were not cut off and fragmented as so many of us are. Like the Thoreau says, we live lives of quiet desperation, this idea that we're sort of cut off from ourselves, we're divided and fragmented. Our imaginative, intuitive side is cut off from our speculative, rational side. Those different parts of the soul or psyche that Plato talked about, in our modern world, they're cut off from each other. But Schiller believed with some nostalgia that in the ancient world it was not like that. These people were unified. They had a kind of integrity that we have lost. Now, when I make this distinction between imaginative, intuitive side and speculative, rational side, we're back to Apollonian and Dionysiac. That idea that Nietzsche formed, but we can look at it anachronistically because it really helps us to understand. Now remember, the Apollonian side is that rational, cool, stoic side of the self, whereas the Dionysiac side is the more wild and irrational and ecstatic side. Once again, Schiller believed that in the ancient world, those two sides were one. Another way in our century that we talk about the Dionysiac-Apollonian split, we often talk about the split between female and male. We talk about the split between East and West, and finally between religion and science. We tend to divide these things. Schiller believed that, again, in the past they were together. Now, interestingly, T.S. Eliot would later term this division of the two sides of the human psyche, he would call it the dissociation of sensibility. But there's a difference. For Eliot, the dissociation of sensibility started about 1700. For Schiller, it started all the way back at the end of the classical age. Now, what did Eliot mean by the dissociation of sensibility? He believed that in the 17th century, the great metaphysical poets, particularly John Donne, were great because their poetry and their philosophy was both imaginative and rational at the same time. And if you ever read poetry by John Donne, it's very rational and scientific, and yet it's profoundly emotional and passionate at the same time. What Eliot argued was, after the 17th century, there was a dissociation of this sensibility. It broke up. And so what he said is, first we got the 18th century, which privileged reason and analysis too much. Then we get the 19th century romantics, and they go to the opposite extreme, and they only talk about passion and imagination and emotion and forget about reason. Now, as you can guess, T.S. Eliot was hoping that he in the 20th century would bring them back together. Maybe he was successful or not. But I want to bring that up because that idea of the dissociation of sensibility is really partly what Schiller's talking about. Except, as I said before, he sees that breakdown as occurring really even during Rome's period. I mean, once we leave the Greeks behind, we're losing that wholeness, that fullness. Now, Schiller's final aesthetic goal is for these two sides to be reintegrated. That's the goal for Schiller. Bring those two sides of our soul, our psyche, back into one. And that's his aesthetic goal, because he thinks that beauty and poetry and whatnot can affect that. Now, let me develop more this idea of these two split sides. In another essay that Schiller wrote, called On Naive and Sentimental Poetry, Schiller develops this distinction between ancient and modern, but here he calls it the naive and the sentimental. Now, what is the naive? The naive, which is linked to the ancient world, is what is simply and directly tied to nature. It rejects all that is artificial or clever, and it is uncorrupted by civilization and society. There's a simplicity, a directness. You're part of the world. You don't feel cut off from nature. Oftentimes we in a technological age are cut off from nature. Not in the naive. Everything's simple and direct. Now, whereas the naive is direct, it's unreflective and unmediated, it's direct and spontaneous, the sentimental is complex, artistic, and strongly self-conscious. You see, in our sentimental age, we don't just experience things directly. We really think too much. We're too strongly self-conscious. We can't have fun because we're always asking, are we having fun yet? To use the old cliche that's popular these days. Now, the only place, Schiller says, that we can still see the naive is in children, in their simple capacity for wonder and in their ability to accept nature as it is. We as adults have lost it. Children still have that sense of naivete, direct love of the world, just unquestioning, spontaneous acceptance. Now, Schiller wants, of course, to restore the lost unity of the naive. That's his project. But he's not going to do it simply through backward-looking nostalgia. The answer is not to forget everything and go back to the naive. We can't do that, just like we don't want to become children again. What he does instead is try to move forward to a higher unity. Move from naive to sentimental to a higher kind of naivete. Now, according to Schiller, it is the role of culture, education, and beauty to achieve this fusion. They all work together. What he calls culture, education, and beauty, their final goal for Schiller is to restore this lost unity. Let us go back to the letters on the aesthetic education of man. Another distinction. Schiller here makes a distinction between the sensuous and formal drives. And it's similar to what we've been talking about, but I want to explain that as well. Schiller has a way of making distinctions and then trying to bring them together. That's partly his method. What is the difference between the sensuous and formal drive? Well, according to Schiller, the sensuous drive is linked to material life, to matter, to body, and to change. In other words, the sensuous drive is the world of becoming, what Plato called the world of becoming. It's linked to the physical, to body, to things that change and decay. The formal drive, on the other hand, is more rational. It is linked to the preservation of personality, to the spirit which remains the same. We might link that to Plato's world of being. Things are preserved, they stay the same. They don't change and decay. Now, to use our terminology again, our sensuous drive is Dionysiac. It is ecstatic, and it leads us to be swept along by sensation, causing our personality to be suspended. Think about it. When you get ecstatic or drunk or something, you sort of leave your personality behind, and you enter into the world of change, the world of flux, the world of becoming. Well, if the sensuous drive is Dionysiac, you can obviously guess that the formal drive is going to be Apollonian. The formal drive seeks a higher, more abstract harmony, free from the restraints of time and space. Again, like the Apollonian, it rises above. It's not chained to things like change, to things like matter, to time and space. It rises above. That is the distinction, again, between the Apollonian and the Dionysiac, or the formal and the sensuous. Let me give you a few more distinctions. The sensuous drive deals with particular cases, with concrete things, and with the object, using that phrase philosophically. The formal drive, on the other hand, takes us into the world of the general law, of the universal, of the subject. And so if we can make those analogies we all did in our SATs, sensuous is to formal, as particular is to general, as concrete is to universal, as object is to subject. Or another way to do it is to think of it as the distinction between the body and the spirit. All right, now, listen carefully, because this is where people get confused. You would think that because sensuous to formal is body to spirit, you might think that sensuous to formal is also form to content. Because, right, the form of a poem is on the outside, like our body's on the outside, and the content's on the inside. But here we have to be counterintuitive. Actually, the sensuous drive is linked to the content of the poem, whereas the formal drive is linked to the form. Why is that? The reason is because it is the form of a poem, rather than the content, that is actually the more timeless, abstract element. It can be studied coolly and rationally. So form is linked to formal drive, is linked to soul, is linked to universal, because it's, again, that formalist idea of the sort of cool, rational, abstract form. So again, that's kind of counterintuitive, but that's the way it works. Now, here, Schiller is being like Kant again, because he's treating form and as an aesthetic end in itself. Again, remember we said he's a formalist. He's linked to form, linked to the formal drive. Now, this is where he breaks again. You might expect me to be saying that Schiller, like Kant, is going to advocate the subordination of the sensuous drive to the dictates of the formal drive. You're probably expecting me to say that, because that's what Kant would say. But this is where Schiller breaks. Instead of wanting to privilege one over the other, he treats the two drives, sensuous and formal, as two distinct but equally valid and vital modes of thought that need to be synthesized. And this is what makes it romantic. Don't privilege the one over the other, but bring them together. We need both Apollonian and Dionysiac. We need both formal and sensuous, and we want to bring them together into a synthesis. Now, according to Schiller, the greatest task of culture and education is to allow these two drives to operate together. Or, in other words, to reintegrate feeling and reason. Or, in Eliot's term, to heal the dissociation of sensibility. I think you see all these ideas are coming together. Schiller deals with them in different ways. Now, he gives us an answer. Out of the fusion of these two drives, the sensuous and the formal, emerges what Schiller calls the play drive. That's what he calls the synthesis of the sensuous and formal drive. He calls it the play drive. Now, very important, by calling it the play drive, Schiller does not mean to be derogatory. He's not making fun of it. Oh, it's childish. It's the play drive. Indeed, man, he insists, is only fully human when he plays. And this is a notion that both the Romantics and Freud would posit as central to human development, right? Freud taught us that it's important for children to play. It's also important for adults to play. Play is something that makes us fuller beings. So again, so often people look down on play as childish. Rather than thinking of play as childish, let's think about it as childlike. Right? We want to be childlike, but not childish. Let me give you an example that I'm going to talk about in a later lecture, but I'll mention it now. Matthew Arnold says that he's really upset by the fact that in the English language, the word curiosity has a bad connotation. We think curiosity is like children. It's Curious George. But what he says is that in the French language, curiosity is an adult thing. It's kind of like the play drive. It seeks to bring together, to explore. And so, again, just because we say play, or in terms of Arnold, because we say curiosity, we don't mean childish. We mean something higher, something childlike. Now, according to Schiller, the play drive, by simultaneously fusing and transcending the other two drives, sets us free from both the physical restraints of nature and the moral restraints of reason. The sensuous drive links us to nature and to all the restraints of our body, while the play drive, since it transcends the two, frees us from that. The formal drive ties us to the moral restraints of reason. We got to fit, these abstract laws. Well, the play drive also frees us from that. That's not to say the play drive is immoral, but it's more amoral. It tries to transcend all these things. I must just butt in here with a little tangent here. It always has bothered me that because of Hitler and fascism, we always identify the Germans with regimentation and strictness and no freedom. I find that a terrible irony because it was the German philosophers, Kant and Schiller, who gave us the philosophical definition of freedom. These German romantics believed in freedom. And it's just such a terrible irony that we move to this regimentation of Hitler. So please remember that, oddly enough, it was the Germans who taught us philosophically what freedom is. I find that very interesting and a terrible irony. All right, let's come back now to the play drive. According to Schiller, the play drive is profoundly incarnational. And again, this is the Christian side of Schiller coming through. I think you all know that the word incarnation in Christianity refers to this belief that in Jesus, God took on human flesh. John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Incarnation in the carne, right? In the meat, in the flesh. Now, sometimes we use the word incarnation in its strictly Christian sense. Jesus is the incarnation of God. But we can also use it in an aesthetic sense. Whenever you take something that is pure and a form and embody it in a body, that's a kind of incarnation. And that's the kind of synthesis or fusion that Schiller is looking for. He wants to get what he calls a living form. In other words, it's a form and it's perfect, but it's living and changing. So what we're doing is bringing together being and becoming and fusing them together. Again, just like Jesus is the eternal God that doesn't change, and yet he's a man who changes and decays and dies. Well, that's what art should be. That's what aesthetics should be. According to Schiller, the play drive affects a marriage between sensuous and formal, between objective nature and subjective mind, between the concrete and the universal. It is a marriage. And you know, in the Bible, marriage is a mystery. It's a shame. We don't really see that anymore. But marriage in the Bible, and both for the Jews and Christians, is the two becoming one flesh. It is mystical. And that's how St. Paul treats it. It is a mystery, a higher fusion. We are not two anymore, but we're one. We've come together as something higher. Let me make one more biblical analogy. Many Christians read the Bible, and they think that what the Bible teaches is that when we die, we become pure spirit, like the angels. This may shock you, but that's not what the Bible teaches. That is actually a very Platonic notion that says throw out the body and become pure soul. In the Bible, the only people that are pure soul are angels. Beasts are pure body. We are both. And the Bible tells us that in heaven, we will receive resurrection bodies. Now, they won't be simple physical bodies like these, but they still will be bodies. So even in heaven, the Bible says, we will be both concrete and universal, both physical and spiritual. And again, think about Jesus' resurrection body. So it's kind of interesting. So I think Schiller is understanding a Christian ethic rather than a Platonic ethic. Well, in the same way that the spirit is joined to this glorious resurrection body, in the same way, the end product of the play drive is not an abstract bodiless idea, as it would be in Plato, but a general, timeless form imbued with a particular dynamic life. So again, the play drive is eternal, and it's pure, and it's perfect, and it's formal, but it is also dynamic and changing and full of life. It is a living form. Now, in that divine, transcendent moment of play, Schiller says, the universal lifts the concrete up into itself. The form consumes the matter. They're brought together. It's as if the universal carries the concrete up, and we could say the other way, the universal comes down into the concrete. That's the fusion we're talking about. Now, according to Schiller, the play drive, and everything I've said about it so far, is basically equivalent to beauty. Everything I've said about the play drive so far can be related to beauty, because both of them are aesthetic. They're ends in themselves. They're free. So let's move on now and talk about what Schiller claims is the role of beauty. And we're still in the letters on the aesthetic education of man. Schiller ascribes a unique role to beauty. And I should say that everything he says about beauty here, again, I think we can say about the humanities, because he's really thinking about the humanities. All right. What does he say about beauty? Just like Kant, Schiller says that beauty is indifferent. It is neither useful nor didactic. It teaches us nothing, and it supplies us with no particular knowledge. This is the same thing with Kant. If someone came up to Schiller and said, poetry is useless, it doesn't teach us anything, he would say, exactly. That's what beauty is. It is a free end in itself. It doesn't teach us anything. It's not didactic. What then does it do? According to Schiller, beauty provides us instead with a totality, a perfect wholeness. Within that whole, we find all faculties existing in a higher harmony. It's that higher synthesis of the play drive, something that transcends both the sensuous and the formal drive. And Schiller says that to experience that wholeness is to enter into a pure aesthetic mood, a state of suspension beyond the confines of time and space. I hope you've all had that experience several times in your life where you're experiencing a great work of art, whether it's literature or opera or whatever, or painting, and suddenly you feel yourself transported, taken again to a higher mode of being, sort of like what we said about the sublime in an earlier lecture. But it takes us to a higher realm. Maybe we might call this a form of aesthetic salvation, if you will. But we're lifted up to a higher, better place. And you know what he says, Schiller? In this mood, this aesthetic mood, we experience true freedom, true play, and true unity. We reach the ultimate. We're taken somewhere where everything comes together. Again, that's a kind of a catharsis again. Now, further, Although beauty and further, through beauty and the sublime, Schiller says, we are empowered to give form to that which is formless and hence terrifying in nature. In other words, we find things in nature that are formless and terrifying. We can't deal with them. Beauty allows us to take that formless terror and put it into a form that can be dealt with. And when we do that, we gain an epistemological, suprasensible victory over nature that frees us from our deepest fears. Let me explain. Remember in Kant, that moment in the sublime when we turn over to reason and we realize, hey, I can handle it. There's something in me that's greater than nature. Well, Schiller's saying a similar thing. Let me give an example with my children. I mentioned my little children before. Sometimes little children are afraid of something, afraid of a shadow. Well, you know what's a great way to handle that, Schiller would say? Take that terrifying shadow and put it in a story. Make it aesthetic. Tell them a story about how the shadow is defeated by a hero. And what's happening is that the aesthetic is allowing us to overcome our fears, and we realize we can handle it. Now remember, there can't be any actual danger. If there's a real dinosaur in your kid's room, you better run. But if they're just afraid of dinosaurs in general, you can put it into an aesthetic form and help the child to deal with his fear. We can handle it. Again, we can rise above nature and our own fears. Still, and this is important, a difference between Schiller and Kant is that Schiller is careful, as Kant is not, to hold on to physical reality. The contemplation of form, Schiller says, must not be cut off from the feeling of life. Finally, Kant takes us away into the abstract. That's his orientation. He wants to go into the abstract. Schiller reminds us, as romantics in general do, that you can't forget the physical. We don't want to just go back to Plato's world of being. We want a higher fusion. And again, that's what makes Schiller more romantic than Kant. Finally, Schiller's aesthetic, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps consciously, turns Plato on his head. Are we getting used to this by now in the series? Turning poor Plato around and around in his grave? Let me show you how it works. First of all, Schiller tells us that beauty proves to us that feeling and thought can occur together. The experience of beauty shows us that we can bring together those sides of our psyche. Our feelings and our thoughts can be brought together. And therefore, Schiller reasons, an education in beauty or art is best able to lead us back to that original naive unity we have lost. We want to get back to that unity to be whole creatures. Beauty is the best able and the most effective at bringing us together. Indeed, for Schiller, beauty and the play drive, as it most fully fuses concrete and universal, body and soul, is better suited than philosophy to heal the disunity within. Philosophy can't heal the disunity because philosophy exacerbates the disunity by being too abstract. Only beauty, poetry, art can balance those two sides of our psyche. And so we end up with this. It is the poets and not the philosophers who are best qualified to form whole, integrated citizens who will not just know justice, but live it out. So again, we've turned Plato on our head because now it's poetry, not philosophy, that makes ideal citizens for an ideal republic. Because for Schiller, ideal citizens are people who have this unity. They're not all irrational or all rational. They are whole and unified. And again, it is beauty and poetry that does this. Only poetry can heal that disunity. Philosophy can't do it. As I said a moment ago, philosophy exacerbates it. To close with a paraphrase from C.S. Lewis, although beauty may possess no survival value, it does give value to survival. Lewis says that about friendship, but we can say about beauty. It has no survival value. Or the way I tell my students, it doesn't help you to live, but it does give you something to live for. It gives value to your survival. Remember that next time a scientific person teases you for your love of the arts. All right, in our next lecture, we will turn to Hegel, and we will see how Hegel continues the romanticization of Kant.